This is our Module 1 lesson on the rhetorical triangle. First, I'm going to start off by talking about just what rhetoric is. There are many different associations that people have with the term rhetoric. Some of these associations are positive, concerning merely the idea of persuasion, sometimes specifically spoken persuasion. There are some people who have negative associations with the term rhetoric and perceive it as lying or in some way manipulating the truth for a given aim. All those personal associations aside, a simple definition of rhetoric is that it is any communication that is used to modify the perspective of another. And that's the Purdue OWL definition, which I think is a really good one. Modifying the perspective is a good way to put it because it's not, the point is not to be deceptive, but rather to try to either persuade the audience or at the very least help listeners or readers be able to have a broadened perspective on an issue. This definition is very broad and it encompasses many different tasks and skills, which are explained in much more detail in our Purdue OWL reading for this week. Rhetoric can include spoken communication, such as speeches, which is how a lot of people think about it, but it is also a vital skill in the realm of writing, which will be our focus in this class. On to the rhetorical situation, which was also in your reading this week. The most basic representation of the rhetorical situation is a triangle, as seen here, with text, audience, and author, as I'm indicating here, as the three elements defining the rhetorical situation. Some discussions of rhetorical situation, including the Purdue OWL discussion, also include other elements like purpose and setting, but the classic three are text, author, and audience. The following slides will briefly explore these three main elements, but remember to complete the Purdue OWL reading to get a full sense of every element, including purpose and setting, which are also vital to understanding a full rhetorical situation. What is a text? The text in a rhetorical situation is whatever communication is being directed from the writer or creator to the audience. It might be an actual written text of any length or type, from something as short as a text message through articles or blog posts, novellas, poetry, to something like a full-length novel. Alternatively, the text, which is in quotes because it might not necessarily be what we think of as a text. The text might be some other form of communication, like a piece of art, even a painting or something like that, a political cartoon, a graphic novel. It could be a speech given out loud at an event, or something like a film or a television episode. All these things can be considered text in the sense that they are communications from a writer or creator to an audience, which makes them a rhetorical situation. So for the purposes of rhetorical situation, a text can be something that's not written down. Now moving on to thinking about the idea of an author. Got a little picture of Shakespeare here. This is what a lot of people think about when they think about author, you know, an old white man, or, you know, someone who sits all day typing at a keyboard. Simply put, the author is just the creator, either the writer or artist, the creator of the message in a rhetorical situation. So as you're in this class, you yourself will be the author for each one of your essays as you're moving forward. One of the most important things to remember as a reader when you're in a rhetorical situation is that authors aren't robots. They are not completely objective, even when they're trying to be. Authors have biases, they have prejudices, they have certain bases of knowledge that are specific to them, and they also have intentions for their texts. It's important to remember this for two reasons. One, if you're the reader, then remembering these things about the author can illuminate the reading, and it can help you to see things in the text you might not otherwise see. It's also important to remember this about authors when you are the author. It's important to remember as an author that you are not objective, that you have these biases, blind spots, levels of knowledge, and all of these things are going to affect the text that you write and can affect the message that you're putting across. So always be thinking about that when you're writing. And one other thing to remember with the idea of author too is that as you're writing, whether you realize it or not, you are creating or projecting for the reader an author persona, a kind of personality or sense of yourself that the reader is getting as you write, that's composed of your language and the way that you use it and all the kind of unspoken things that you're putting into your prose. And all of these aspects of the author affect the resulting communication, as I said, because they make up the author persona. The final point of the rhetorical triangle, the classic rhetorical triangle, is the audience. The audience is split into two different groups or levels. The first is the intended audience. That's the person or group that the author intended or was trying to reach with his or her communication. However, there's also the actual audience. The actual audience is usually bigger. That is all the people who actually end up reading or viewing the communication. It's important to keep this distinction in mind. Some examples that would be familiar to anyone, the first one would be text messages. Most people have at some point sent a text message or an email intending for that message to go to one person, say a mother or grandmother, and instead the message ends up accidentally going to a friend instead, which affects the communication, how it's received. If the message is sent to one intended audience but reaches a different actual audience, then the response to that text message is going to be different. Another example would be viral videos or online posts. Sometimes a person will post a YouTube video or something intending for that video's audience to simply be friends, or maybe just people who already follow that person's YouTube channel, but for whatever reason, people really like it and it goes viral. And so a post that the intended audience for was maybe 1,000 people suddenly has been viewed by 1 million people. In that case, it's very obvious that the actual audience is much, much bigger than the intended audience. One final example of this is older texts that have remained popular, so that to go back to Shakespeare, when Shakespeare was writing his plays in the late 1500s, early 1600s, he was writing for an intended audience of people in his immediate surroundings, London playgoers, people of the upper classes and the nobility who would come view performances, but also people who were living on the street. But it was a specific, though diverse in class, it was a specific area, it was a specific type of writing. It was written to be performed out loud, to be acted out, not necessarily to be read until later he prepared them for publication. That was the intended audience. However, because his plays have remained popular for hundreds of years, the actual audience has been massively bigger than his intended audience was, because his plays remain popular. So over the course of hundreds of years, many, many, many millions of people have read or seen these plays performed. And so there's a massive difference between the intended audience and the actual audience. The biggest reason to remember this difference is because it can help you when you're composing your essay to be more aware of the audience. Audience awareness is the idea that you are always keeping in mind how a potential audience might perceive the things that you're writing. And having good audience awareness can lead you to do lots of things. It can lead you to create clearer sentences, to make your writing easier to understand. It can lead you to do things like avoiding jargon, that's technical language, speech that the average person wouldn't understand. Sometimes students who are athletes, for example, writing about their sports might put in names of obscure rules without defining them. That's an example of using jargon, and that can alienate the reader, alienate the audience, if the audience does not know what those rules are. So defining terms can really help your audience. That's one way to be audience aware. Also, when you're writing in class, your intended audience usually is simply the instructor, because that paper is being written for a grade. However, it is very beneficial for you to imagine a wider actual audience, because that's going to lead you to be the most audience aware and to create the best product possible. If you are imagining a much larger actual audience, then you're going to be more careful to explain things. You're not going to assume anything, because who knows who could read it. And these three elements together, author, text, audience, as well as some other elements from your reading, things like purpose and setting. All of these things are present anytime there's a rhetorical situation. Even something like writing in a private diary, for example, the rhetorical situation is still present. Obviously, there's a text present. Obviously, there's an author present. And a person might say, well, there's no audience because I'm writing for myself. That's true. However, you yourself will go back later, presumably, to read what you wrote. So even though you are your own audience, there is still an audience. Perhaps the only audience-less text might be to write something, put it in a bottle, throw it out into the ocean, knowing that no one will ever find it or something like that. But in the case of private writing, something like a journal or diary, if the writer will be reading that text later, there still is an audience. So the rhetorical situation cannot be escaped. It's there in any situation of writing we ever do, which is why it's so important to keep in mind what the rhetorical situation is and how to use that awareness to create the best text possible.